Going.
Okay.
All right. Well, Roger, we've messaged a little bit back and forth, but and you've learned a little bit about me by watching my channel. Why don't you tell us a little bit about you?
Well, a bit of background. I'm living in a town just south of Barcelona, about 20 kilometers south of Barcelona, called Castelldefels. And I've been here for about 4 years. Before that, I was living in Barcelona. Altogether, I've lived in Catalonia for about 35 years.
Oh, wow.
So I've been working here as an English teacher with the British Council in Barcelona, translator as well, off and on.
Where were you born?
I was born in Northern Ireland, actually.
Oh.
That's where I originate. I grew up in a Christian home. My parents were Christian brethren. I'm not sure how familiar you are with that denomination, but when I went to university, Queen's University Belfast, I became associated with IFES, or the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students.
Oh, okay.
It's yeah. I'm not sure what it's IVF, I suppose, is it, in the US? Yeah. And to some extent with Agape as well, with Crew, who were based in Ireland and had a ministry, and we're trying to get a ministry off the ground in Northern Ireland as well. So I had a kind of one foot in both camps. And yeah, I did French and Spanish at university, and then I came to live in Spain, started to teach English just after graduating in 81, and worked in a town north of Madrid, a city called Valladolid. I don't know how familiar you are with Spain. I know that you speak Spanish through your experience as a missionary in the Dominican Republic, but yeah, so I lived and worked in Valladolid in a school teaching English, a school that had been started by a former OM missionary who was a Cambridge graduate, and he had a vision for kind of creating a service for the community, using it not evangelistically, but to provide the kind of service that there was a great deal of demand for in Spain at that time. So I just arrived in Spain at the time the TEFL industry was booming, and
Why do you think the learning English as a second language is such a booming industry? Why has English become the language of the world in many respects?
Wow. That's a good question. I guess there's a great deal of historical baggage. Colonialism had a big part to play. The British Council was a kind of a perpetuation of the British of the British colonies. I hesitate to use the term empire, but it kind of it took advantage of the legacy of the kind of dominion of that English language and culture had acquired globally by that stage. So there are other reasons as well. The US, I mean, had a huge part to play in that after the Second War. I mean, most of my students weren't all that interested in exploring British culture. They were much more interested. I remember specifically when I was teaching in Zaragoza, a class of teenage girls. They didn't want to know anything about British culture. What they wanted was me to translate the words of Greece So so it was kind of John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John at that stage. American culture, American music, American cinema. Yeah. So I guess, yeah, the English language wouldn't have made it globally had it not been for you guys.
Oh, wow. I guess we'll have to answer for some of this at some point.
Yeah, you've got a great deal to answer for. Yeah.
Why was that? I mean, I've known a variety of people who have gotten into teaching English as sort of a pretext for traveling. Why? But you've made a career of it.
I have made a career. It wasn't my intention initially. I did Spanish and French with a view to being a teacher of modern languages in the UK eventually, but I wanted to learn the languages before I actually started, because at university, at least the way languages were taught at university in the UK at that time, it was more kind of literature and culture, but literature through English, Spanish literature through English rather than through Spanish. Most of the literary essays that I had to write were written in English, and most of the culture and literature that we did was like, we started off with 17th century, 16th, 17th century literature, and we didn't really move very far beyond the 19th century, you know. So yeah, so I needed to get a proper grounding in the Spanish language as it really was spoken. My Spanish wasn't very good. My French wasn't very good at that time. I thought it wasn't good enough for me really to take on the responsibility of getting British kids, Irish kids through high-level examinations. I mean, that's the course that most modern languages teachers follow. They simply graduate from university, go straight into a teaching career.
Yep.
But long story, you know, I ended up deciding to stay in Spain for a number of reasons. I got married to a young lady, Catalan lady, and that resulted in me spending most of my career here. I'm actually divorced now, but my two grown-up kids are a very good reason for me to remain in Catalonia. So I don't have any particular intention to move back to my home country. This has become my home country, I guess.
Yeah. Are you a naturalized citizen, or
No,
how does that work there?
No, I've still got British nationality.
Okay.
I've actually now got Irish nationality as well. I was able to acquire an Irish passport, which I thought it was a good idea to do in the context of Brexit, which threatened and still threatens to complicate the lives of British expats living in the European Union. So any part of the European Union, yeah. So.
Oh, that's fascinating. So you've also been involved in a lot of evangelical. I mean, you mentioned the International Fellowship of Evangelicals. Do you attend church? What kind of church do you attend?
Yeah, I attend a church here in Castelldefels. In terms of, I'm not particularly attached to any denomination. In Spain, you know, if you're kind of Protestant, if your background is Protestant, you know, and you're settling in a town, the range of options isn't all that broad in terms of the actual denomination that you end up associating yourself with. So whatever your kind kind of denominational background might be, you for convenience, or because there are no other churches in the area, you might end up being attached to a denomination that is different from the one that you grew up in, so but yeah, so it's actually a Baptist, I guess. It's non-denominational. Well, they would call themselves non-denominational. I suppose it's loosely based on Baptist, a Baptist format. But and that's the kind of denomination that I was associated with before coming to Costa de Fels as well. But as I say, I'm fairly kind of becoming increasingly kind of ecumenical in terms of my kind of receptivity to what God can teach me through other, not only Protestant denominations, but other Christian traditions, and YouTube has contributed greatly to expanding my mind in that regard, and your channel has had a lot to do with that as well. Your conversations with Jonathan Peugeot and his channel as well. So yeah, but the church that I'm associated with now, it's fairly cosmopolitan, and there are people there from all over the world. I mean, there are about kind of 50 or 60 different denominations. It's not a very big church, but there's a large number of nationalities represented. East Europeans, Latin Americans, quite a lot of Peruvians, Argentinians, Brazilians especially. So that has been a mind-broadening experience as well. And what I appreciate about this particular church, and I think it's increasingly the case with the evangelical churches that I'm familiar with here in Spain, there's a strong sense of community responsibility or community service. So the church actually has a restaurant, which it's regarded as, seen as by the local community as well, not only by the members of the church, but as a solidarity restaurant. So it's got a very significant role to play in the community, and it's highly respected in that regard, because they devote themselves not only to providing food for people who come for meals. It operates as a regular restaurant in that regard, but the helpers in the restaurant, in many cases, are being mentored. They're refugees, immigrants, so non-documented, not illegal, but undocumented, in the sense that they have to be in this country for 3 years before they can achieve documented status, and before they have the right to be contracted by an employer, which is a huge obstacle for them to overcome. I suppose it's intended to discourage them from staying too long, but the church provides training and mentorship and community as well. A family, it's a kind of a family, it's really so heartwarming to be in the restaurant at kind of 12 o'clock midday, and to have a huge table in the middle of the restaurant with helpers from different parts of the world sitting around it, Moroccans, people from Ecuador, and Venezuelans, Argentinians, Russians, Ukrainians. It's really, and the lady who coordinates that is a member of the church. She's got such a heart for God and such a heart for people as well, and that kind of has provided a space within which the idea of, well, your estuary idea kind of plays into that in a sense, you know, and that's why I was keen. One of the reasons why I was keen to have a conversation with you, because the space is there, the facilities are there, the kind of facilities that many churches, I think, would long to be able to have, but haven't got, you know. Yeah. So we've actually got and the fact of people feeling the need to practice their English provides an opportunity for that as well. So we have a Thursday morning, at the moment it's only Thursday morning, what we call the Delta Circle, which is, I'm calling it that partly because of the estuary idea, which which I can thank you for, but also because there is very near where I live, there is a river estuary, there's a river delta, which is quite well known, and it's visited by a lot of people. It's a space where, yeah, where I mean, it operates as an estuary. So the idea of kind of creating this space for people with different kind of religious backgrounds or non-religious backgrounds, you know, atheists and humanist people who were somewhere in the spectrum, you know, between belief and non-belief, you know, some conception of God, of a supreme being, of something transcendent, a transcendent reality, that and some really good conversations have taken place within that context with the people who have been coming to that, you know. Not that all the conversations are necessarily religious in nature, or I mean, we basically take the conversation wherever it goes, you know. We come together and yeah, it might end up being a serious conversation. It might end up going off in all kinds of directions. Yeah, but in order to introduce some kind of systematic approach, I've started within the context of the Delta Group, which meets every Thursday. We've started a reading circle as well. So we're once a month, we devote the 2 hours or so between 11 and 1 to doing English literature. Yeah, James Joyce, Shakespeare,
wow,
Seamus Heaney, you know. So and that has become very popular and very, yeah, the people who are coming along to that really appreciate it. They appreciate the opportunity to come together with that purpose, you know. So so obviously there are opportunities for taking the conversation in spiritual directions, but that isn't the agenda, you know. It's not. So
so how did you find my channel? I mean, it's not a terribly big channel.
It was through Jordan Peterson, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, it was. I started listening to Jordan Peterson, I think, before you started commenting on his work. It was. I'm not sure exactly how. I think it was because of his biblical lectures. I was in there right kind of near the beginning of the Genesis series, and I thought this was wonderful. You know, you know, biblically so deep. The way he was unpacking the stories of the patriarchs, and his theological insights, or insights which I regard as theological, even though he doesn't identify as a Christian. But I've been able to benefit from with the teaching of many very good Bible teachers. Tim Keller has explored the similar topics in Genesis in depth, and also Bible teachers like John Lennox, with whom I'm quite familiar, and another Bible teacher that I kind of was mentored by or grew up under the teaching of in Northern Ireland, by the name of Professor David Gooding. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He was a classicist, but a very engaging Bible teacher who was able to unpack the symbolism and the symmetries of the Old Testament books, of Genesis in particular. And when I came across Jordan Peterson and what he was saying, his teaching was kind of reminding me of that, bringing that back to mind. I found that there was a great deal in common. So I really, and I found that a very helpful bridge into conversations on those topics with friends who were skeptics, who still define themselves themselves skeptics, but but as a result of those conversations about Jordan Peterson, they have become, I think, less skeptical. And some of the classes, actually, in some cases, they've been English classes that I've had with some people who have become friends, skeptics who have become friends, and also students. We've, at their request, in some cases, we actually discuss Old Testament books, and some of our classes have become virtual Bible studies, but it's not something that I've been pushing. So I found Jordan Peterson's and also then Jonathan Pajot's Symbolic World, and Robert Barron. I mean, these are, and yourself. I mean, all of this has served to kind of enrich my knowledge, but also my engagement, with people within that kind of spectrum of skepticism, from skepticism to different kind of stages of belief. And I see myself as my role as being to kind of move people along the spectrum towards belief. So I think that's where the Estuary idea really grabbed my imagination. I've got some very good friends here who don't identify as believers in any sense at all, but who've been coming along to these conversations, and who would like there to be more of them, and even for those conversations to be more specifically geared towards big questions, questions involving, exploring the meaning of life and the meaning crisis. And so I see myself as kind of, I'm in a kind of receptive stage at the moment, but I mean, to some extent, the engagement and the interactions have already been taking place, but I've still got so much to learn, and I feel that God is opening channels of communication in that regard, So the Estuary idea is something that I really want to run with, I want to, and yeah.
Have you have you talked to John Van Donk at all about his Estuary host support network?
No, I haven't.
I'll have to connect you up with
Mhm.
John. One of the well, so Estuary in some ways grew out of my own experience here locally and then on the channel, but also I think a deep longing for the fact that the church has not been seen as a place where people might pursue with some confidence a a space for conversation, for exploration, that the church has tended, I think probably rightly so, to have given itself a reputation for dogmatic programming, which of course is, certainly churches look to form and catechize individuals, but not terribly open to individuals that wish to explore. And in fact, the church has almost had very little now I don't want to use the word program, but that's the best word I can think of. The church didn't have a program for explorers. It was all the programming for exploration was deeply, channeled in terms of, okay, you're going to start here, but we're going to get you here. And that's absolutely legitimate for the church. But
Yeah.
in our cultural context, that feels way too mercenary, manipulative, and I think unhospitable or inhospitable. Yeah. So I'm fascinated at what you've begun with your Delta group, and but I'm not in any way surprised, because one of the things that I think Jordan Peterson really did help open up was a place where meaning could be explored. And it could also be that part of the reason we're seeing a need for an estuary type movement now is because I think universities did in the past have a reputation for that, but part of this Jordan Peterson moment was, in a sense, his sounding the alarm that universities reputationally have sort of become like churches too. That here is the doctrinal orthodoxy of the church, even though the university has all of this lip service about openness and exploration. In reality, it has become quite a bit more dogmatic, and it is trying to create its own forms of activism and missionary zeal. So I'd see that as some of the ways this stuff has come together. So one of the things that John Van Donk, a friend of mine, he's been on my channel a number of times. If you search his name on YouTube with mine, I'm sure you'll find the playlist that John and I have done. But John was a former minister in the Christian Reformed Church, left the ministry because of some personal reasons in his life, has been sort of an outsider. And he always feels himself as an outsider from church, even though he, I think his church sees him very much as one of their own, but had a lot of interest in facilitating the formation of much more exploratory groups. And so because I didn't have the time really to pastor and foster a bunch of these groups, he started now a list of he started now some online groups that are basically designed to train, facilitate, encourage, support leaders who do such groups. And so he's got over a dozen now people that are participating in those groups. And it's in terms of Christian terms, it's not dissimilar to sort of small group methodology, but that's something that you, or maybe some of the people that you're you're participating, that are participating in your group might have some interest in, and I can send you some more information about that. But why did you want to talk to me?
Well, that was one of the reasons. I mean, because, and also, yeah, I mean, that was one of the topics. But I found your channel extremely helpful in many ways, and I wanted to kind of acknowledge that and thank you for it as well. And the reason I sent that essay to you, you know, was kind of maybe to open up a conversation in that area as well. Because I mean, obviously, I realized when I was writing that I ran the risk of misrepresenting you know, many of the thinkers that I was alluding to, because I can't say that I'm not a philosopher. But I thought that in your conversations, especially your references to God number one, God number two, you know, that there was this was something that I feel kind of challenged by as well, you know. And in evangelism, you know, one of the lines that you kind of begin conversations with, or that I remember from university days, was, you know, would you like to know God personally? But that question, you know, what does that mean? You know, and does that question actually make any sense to anybody nowadays? You know, what sort of God are you talking about? Are you talking about God number? If you're talking about God number one, then obviously the conception of a personal relationship with God number one doesn't make much sense, because we're not talking about a personal entity with agency and with the desire to engage in a relationship with humankind, but rather with the, well, you know, the kind of you know, pantheistic type of God that we are all part of, you know, or but who remains, or which remains impersonal and transcendent. And you know, we might owe our existence to this being, but the idea of a personal relationship with. So I've been very interested by what John Vervaeke has been saying in his conversations with you and with others, and his whole kind of well, his conception of what you have referred to as God number one, although he doesn't use that term with reference to the kind of sacred entity that he feels somehow committed to as well, because there is a commitment. It's not just yeah. So I thought it was interesting, and I wanted to kind of engage with that and explore it and dig into it a bit. And yeah, I've actually been doing a course in philosophy informally on Sunday evenings with online. It's been online and also face to face to some extent, with a philosopher doing a doctorate in philosophy. He's a believer as well, but he's totally kind of yeah, committed to kind of opening the minds of thinking people to the to metaphysics, and specifically to God as a personal entity, not only as a metaphysical kind of essence, you know. So so it was as a result of being asked to write an assignment on God and philosophers by this guy that I produce this text, and then but it's yeah, I just thought it was so I thought I would kind of pass on to you my thoughts in that regard, with a view to maybe some of my misconceptions being corrected or criticized as well, you know. And I mean, it's a conversation that I want to continue to have with you and with others as well. I mean, I'm not sure how. I appreciate the fact that you read it, and I thank you for saying that you found it helpful. And but if there's anything that needs correcting, I mean, I'm kind of at the beginning of a learning curve in terms of really getting my head around this, and obviously, you know, I'm approaching it from the perspective of having benefited from a great deal of biblical teaching, but without kind of making the connections with the kind of ways in which people conceive of God, or the ways in which people define God, you know. So yeah.
Well, I think, I mean, very, very quickly, in the YouTube sort of got paid a lot of attention to some of the sparring between Christian apologists and new atheists, and that had its heyday. And in some ways, YouTube was a medium that was ideal for such a pursuit. It's very clear, if you have a YouTube channel and if you're paying attention to the analytics, many others have noted this too, anything that is sort of anything that is sort of combative produces hits and views and interest. And so this, in contemporary evangelicalism, sort of boiled down to, does or doesn't God exist? As if both sides of the argument had a very clear picture in their mind of what they meant by that word God. And of course, Jordan Peterson came around, and because of how he sort of postured himself, and I think a lot of people weren't, including myself, sufficiently understanding of the strange sorts of combinations that a Jungian would bring into this space, you know, very quickly said, I'm going to back away from this God, does he or doesn't he, because I don't think believe means what these people want it to mean, and I don't think God means what these people want it to mean. And so I thought that came very clear to me in the first YouTube debate as such between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, that these two were not so much arguing about whether or not there's a super thing in the sky. That's very much how Sam Harris wanted to define what Christians understood by God. And Jordan Peterson quite clearly had a very different use for that. Now, one of the things that, you know, modern philosophy in some ways arises at the dawn of modernity with Descartes, and I think part of that was a desire to, in some ways, in a rather estuary type move, create a less partisan space for conversations about meaning, about what is ultimate, and so you can very much see how they connected up with the ancient Greeks. And I found John Vervaeke to be very helpful, especially lately, as he has been pushing against the contemporary framing of philosophy that has tended to be much more sort of a disembodied thinky talky space about, we're going to sit back here and talk about existence all out there, but in terms of our own real lives, we're going to go about our business.
It's become very, very academic, propositional, to use one of, I mean, debates specialize in propositional knowledge, you know, they don't really move beyond that. And that's what I found fascinating and so engaging about John Vervaeke, and his very definition of belief as well. You know, when he separates, or when he refers to belief as being a question of trust and commitment, you know, rather than only intellectual assent to a series of propositions, you know. And I think he's got it absolutely right, you know. And I think that debates need to, in fact, the term debate itself, I think needs perhaps to be scrapped, you know, because, and conversation as a term makes much more sense, because it's a personal engagement. And it inevitably is going to involve the participatory aspect of knowledge as well, because it's an engagement between two people, not between two sets of ideas, you know, and or two or more people, you know. And that's what, so I totally, I found that those John Vervaeke's 4 different types of knowledge, I found that to be extremely helpful in this regard, in moving the conversations on, you know, to a much more productive space. And sorry, I think I might have interrupted you.
Oh, that's fine. But I agree. And I think for this reason, we're going to see, the rise of more embodied participatory modes of exploration, rather than these assumptions that life as it's framed and constituted is sort of beside the point of all of this metaphysical or metaphorical exploration, and we can sort of hold these two worlds side by side, and not have one interfere with the other. And I think that's, on one hand, for some people, a very productive opportunity, but it's also a tremendously threatening opportunity, because in a sense, status quo has a degree of comfort about it communally, because we sort of know what to expect from the other. And I think part of the bargain of secularity within modernity was that I won't trouble your house if you don't trouble my house. And
exactly.
And so moving philosophy from a classroom where we sort of in this sacred space explore ideas, but walk out and you know, do whatever we lay our hand to, the end of that will be it'll be dramatic in some cases. And I think someone like John Vervaeke is coming at this honestly. You know, I just actually this morning I was looking at some YouTube, and the algorithm brought forward someone who was just going on and on about Jordan Peterson is a grifter. And I thought, I've met a lot of grifters. Jordan Peterson's grift is a very strange one. If it's merely that, it's part of the reason I don't believe it is. But when I look at someone like John Vervaeke, it's quite clear that he is being very honest, and he's being very generous with his audience. And I think all of that comes from a place of some pretty deep sincerity. Absolutely. With respect to, he doesn't just want to know the truth out there in an abstract, disembodied way. He wants to participate in the truth and in the beauty and in the good. And I think he's right in that philosophy, pre-modern philosophy and classical philosophy was likely much more of that, except that part of the dilemma that we continue to have is that you and I are these two disembodied images talking, across an electronic platform. And that's, I'm grateful for that. But the platforms itself, just as a book, reading a book of Plato or about Plato is a very different thing than we would imagine going back in time, landing in ancient Greece and seeing all of the contextuality of that situation. And, we might simply be overwhelmed by certain aspects that we bring to the experience that we would completely dismiss or disregard or find Plato uninteresting, perhaps. I mean, who knows? But and that's, I think, part of Tom Holland's thesis, that there's a strangeness between the worlds because they are embodied, that to one degree or another we have to reckon with.
In a conversation that you had recently, I can't remember which one it was, but I was kind of reminded of the film Good Will Hunting. Do you know the film Good Will Hunting? Do you remember the conversation between Robin Williams and Matt Damon on the park bench? When Robin Williams kind of said, the character played by Robin Williams said, I'm sure that if I asked you about Michelangelo, you could give me a list of his works in chronological order. You could give me all the encyclopedic knowledge that I could ever expect to have, because you've probably read everything there is to be read about Michelangelo. But have you ever been in the Sistine Chapel? Have you ever experienced, what it's like? And he said, you could probably give me, you could tell me what love is you could analyze it, perceptively and impressively as well. But do you know what it's like to wake up next to the woman that you have given your life to and that has given her life to you? I can't remember exactly what, but so it really kind of exposed, I think, that problem with modernity, basically, and the absence of participatory knowledge, real participation, that so often characterizes that kind of knowledge, and therefore that kind of engagement, that kind of debate. But as far as theology is concerned, I mean, if you look at the way Jesus did his teaching, Jesus taught people. It wasn't propositionally, or it was propositionally, but it was much more than that. It was participatory. He was involving himself in people's lives. He was, and the less, I mean, the truths that he was teaching, that he wanted people to grasp, obviously had a kind of propositional aspect, because they were truths about the character of God, but he didn't give them a list of propositions. He showed them what it was like to be in a right relationship with God and with each other as well. His teaching was relational, and our apologetics, our conversations must be like that as well, and yeah. So that's something perhaps we have learned from postmodernism, the reassessment of the importance of narrative, of the importance of story. Not that truth is predicated on individual experience, or is determined by individual experience, which it isn't, and that's perhaps one sense in which postmodernism has gone off the rails, because it has kind of completely removed proposition from the equation totally, so that no propositions exist any longer. It's just individual stories, individual experiences, your truth, my truth, and if there's a contradiction between them, well, who's to say which one is right? Okay, but we don't need to go that far, but at the same time we can learn from them and I mean, this is nothing new as well. Scripture itself is narrative. It's about people. It's about real kind of human experiences, and that's something that Jordan Peterson has brought out in his teaching on Genesis as well. He really tears up, when he talks about these individuals, Cain and Abel and Joseph and his dysfunctional relationship with his brothers, and yeah. So sorry, I've gone off on a bit of
no, that's fine. That's what we do. Well, it strikes me too, given your story, and I've often used, at least for English speakers, which is probably a very limited illustration for many, but the difference, between even in high school Spanish, if you learn saber and conocer,
yeah,
and in English, we have, they're sort of taken up in this one word, to know, and which, of course, if you were raised in a community, and fewer are, who, let's say, had the King James version of the Bible, Adam knew Eve and begat, and it's like, as a little kid, what do you mean he knew Eve and begat? I mean, there's obviously there's a certain kind of knowledge going on there that goes way beyond, I know the postman, hopefully, and these it's something so foundational and basic, yet that in many ways is the difference that we're talking about. And lately I've been talking about the third personal, which is, again, is sort of the proposition, and the first personal, which is much more participatory, procedural, perspectival, and the fact that I was just this morning, YouTube forever has been promoting the Ian McGilchrist, to me, the Ian McGilchrist conversation at Ralston College, and the lecture he gave there. But again, so much of Ian McGilchrist's work has been this question between the third personal and the first personal. And that's in some ways, the left brain is sort of the third personal. It wishes to abstract, and you have to sort of abstract things up, and make them public, make them transcendent, allow them to communicate between us, but it's always in relation with the first personal, and we're constantly going back and forth, and knowledge is in some ways caught in that space. And again, part of the difficulty we face, even as I was just impressed by this last Sunday when, I'm preaching on the last half of the first chapter of the Gospel of John, when John the Baptist, two of John the Baptist's disciples decide they're going to leave John the Baptist and become a disciple of Jesus. And Andrew's question to Jesus is, where are you staying?
Yes.
He doesn't ask, well, give me an outline of the propositions that you are delineating that perhaps are a little different from my old master John. He says, where are you staying? Well, why do you want to know that? I mean, you haven't once asked me for my street address, what's going on here? But of course, the idea is that where are you staying? Because I want to go and be with you and watch you and live with you. And in that process of me living with you, I am now going to, in small ways, you are going to become part of me and I will become part of you.
Yes. Yeah. And so many of Jesus' individual encounters were like that as well, with Zacchaeus as well, that come down because I want to have a meal with you. And then salvation has come to this house. It's it's totally replete with invitation, with participation, with connection, I think we need to engage with people at that. Well, that's what I mean. Love is the whole idea of. I mean, that's God is love. That's I think what it means in practical terms. God is love. God is participation in your life. God is there wanting you to become part of what he's doing, part of who he is as well. Theosis. I mean, to borrow an Eastern Orthodox term as well, it's about involvement in, participation in the character of God, and and God being involved in our experience as well. So absolutely, yeah, I think it's yeah.
So it's so interesting to me that we have received a lot of this knowledge via the church, but we haven't noticed it, haven't paid attention to it. But, so much of that is bound up in the life of the church. I used to joke with people when there was a time early on in my ministry here when, after my honeymoon phase in the church lasted about 7 or 8 months, and then some of the people who initially hired me had some regrets about having hired me, because of course you don't really know who you're hiring when you're hiring them. The rest of the church was quite happy with the hire, but this particular group was upset. And they, as you said, about, as is often true of expat churches, not a lot of options. And so this group of people very much wanted to stay Christian Reformed, but didn't want to go to any of the Christian Reformed churches in the area. And so I used to quip that I should start a virtual Christian Reformed church in Sacramento, so all of the former members of my church could still participate in the Christian Reformed church, even though they'd never have to go to one. And part of the life of the church, even though this has been estranged to one degree or another by a variety of necessities and institutionalizations, is in fact the if you want to be a part of I'd often tell this to people who would come and say, well, Pastor, I'd really like to be a part of your church. Can I join? I'd say, well, the official movement towards joining is, while important, it's insufficient to actually become a part of the church. In order to become a part of the church, you have to be here. and you have to participate, and you have to do so with a degree of fidelity and regularity that people can begin to trust you and count on you. And if you don't do those things, your membership status is really quite unimportant, because that is, something about a church is a shared life together.
Yeah.
And
membership cannot be theoretical.
No. It has to be, it has to have a physical component. It has to be about presence and space and interaction. And then eventually what happens when human beings are in a space together, they learn whether or not they can trust one another, because that trust is really the foundation for the community beginning to actually become a body. And all that language is about, we are a body. We are, in some Vervaeke words, we are sort of a super thing, and we act together. And in order to do that, we have conversations, and we have conflicts, and we have challenges, but we also have commitment, and we give money, and we give time, and we have skin in the game, and we give reputation and identity. And of course, all of that, if you're involved in any kind of church setting, this is the lifeblood of being human in the church. And all of the propositional stuff certainly has its role to play, because that's part of the matrix, but you can't just distill all of the human stuff away and be left with that and still have the same thing.
I think this kind of embodied connection with each other can take many different forms. I know there are some traditions for which 3 or 4 people kind of meeting together in an informal environment without liturgy, and without the rituals, they would not consider that to be church, but I think it definitely can be, and there are some contexts in which believers have no choice but to meet in that kind of setting, and they have to dispense with liturgy and ritual necessarily, because they simply don't have they don't have access to the kinds of visual trappings which for many traditions are absolutely essential, but it reminds me of a conversation that I kind of participated briefly in the Discord server. With reference to what Robert Barron had said about there being something missing in the kind of church from which the icons and images were absent, and I can take his point. I can understand why he would say that, why a Catholic would say that, because those images are the means through which they enter this kind of sacred space, and they make this connection with God, but there are so many places and so many contexts in which that simply cannot happen, even if the congregants would like it to happen, So I think that God is the believers themselves, in a sense, become the the icons,
Yes.
the you know the kind of repository of this beauty that the Holy Spirit is constructing, is creating within the lives of human beings, and those images are visible to other people who see God's glory
Yes.
being manifest in the lives of ordinary people, that something beautiful is being made out of these kind of broken, ragged, formerly lost and disoriented individuals for whom life had ceased to have any meaning, and now something beautiful is being made out of that human raw material, so to speak. And that is the beauty that we see when we enter a congregation in which there might or might not be images and icons on the wall. But I think that is perhaps a perspective that we need to recover. That I don't know if you've. I'm sure in the Dominican Republic you had many kind of experiences of that kind. Where the context was very rudimentary and very devoid of of what would normally be associated with
devoid of walls
with
often.
the church.
No, that's
Very
right.
often,
I mean, there was no building, there was no
yeah.
structure. But you're right. Part of, I think, so we have a Nigerian Anglican church that rents space from us for their Sunday services, and they for me have been a fascinating watching them has been a fascinating example in terms of culture, church, symbol, because they're Anglicans. They tend to do more with vestments. They have a physical cross that they will bring through. I mean, they do much more than the very plain tradition that I was formed in of the Christian Reformed Church, which isn't which isn't completely dogmatically plain, but in practice, not too far from it. And I think a lot of Protestantism has been an exploration of minimalism in terms of just how thin, can this thing get in terms and still have it go. And part of Protestantism, especially confessional Protestantism, has been, well, there's sort of a confessional backbone that would sort of anchor the body. But on the American scene, after the experience of the frontier, where even that was sort of taken away. And I think in some ways, when you were describing the options on the table as a Protestant living in a overwhelmingly traditional Catholic context, the Protestant options on the menu are limited, and that then sort of forms what was perhaps similar on the American frontier, on the American Western frontier, where about all they had was Jesus and the Bible. That's about as minimalism as you can get. I mean, it's like church in a book and church in a name. And that, of course, that took root in the American West and became part of Christianity. But very quickly, time then adds its layers. And in every little group, there will be elements of tradition that begin to develop even in that tiny little group in a very little amount of time, so that and those traditions will then scale usually through the people into maybe someone came from a particular Baptist church and someone came from this tradition. You've got a few Anglicans here, and then they come together and then they start doing things on a regular basis. And even those things begin to mix and become a unique set of elements in what will be a unique body of Christ in one place and time. And, as you describe your church, I think about, I have a friend, Tim Blackman, who pastored an international, it was an English language church in The Hague in the Netherlands. It was a church he grew up in. And, there again, you have these expat churches, which will have people from all around the world coming together in one place, vastly different traditions and all the cultural layers on top of them, and all coming together to form a body of Christ. And it is identifiable and distinctively Christian, yet brought together. And so figuring out what exactly that thread is that winds and weaves through all churches, even devoid of very much tradition at all, but somehow still manages to work. It's really an astounding thing.
Yeah. It occurs to me that you can imagine a context where the Christian church is being persecuted, right? You've got this kind of town in the Middle East with, I don't know if this situation would arise, but conceivably there could be about 10 people each representing a different Christian tradition, somehow kind of thrown together, and then they find themselves needing some kind of Christian fellowship, so what do they do, and how do they instantiate that in the body life that the Holy Spirit wants to and kind of produce within them and among them, So obviously there'll be a lot of conflict initially, and because some of the traditions that some of them want to carry in will be completely alien to other people, and yet these people need to meet together, otherwise they'll end up completely stranded in their own little cell, with even if they're not locked up, even if they're not going to, but the Holy Spirit will be driving them, bringing them together, finding ways of bringing them together, and maybe we need to imagine ourselves in a situation like that. It's and what are we going to sacrifice? How absolute are we going to make those things which we had taken for granted as being fundamental?
Yes.
Before we found ourselves in this situation, so it's something that I found myself thinking a lot about recently. I mean, we were talking about an estuary of the kind which brings skeptics and Christians together, but there are other kinds of estuaries. There's a Christian estuary spaces occupied by Christians from different traditions coming together. It might be difficult for them to meet within a church to do church together, because the obstacles would be just too great, for them to be able to do that. But they could. It could be a very mutually enriching encounter if there was a space in which they could, share with each other, and just pray together and and allow God to teach them through each other.
Oh, and when I think, part of the reason I always ask about people's lives is, that in some ways has been part of it sounds like it's been part of your story, especially your descriptions of the church that you are attending, that this is it is amazing what God can pull together, and how these elements reemerge in identifiable church, in and often, one of the I remember my son, my oldest son, after he went away to college and came back and was playing guitar for the church here for a while before he moved to another part of the country. It wasn't until he left and came back that he could look at this church and say, this is a crazy diverse church, and it's such a little church, but you've got incredibly well-educated people, you've got illiterate people, you've got people with considerable financial resources, you've got people with no financial resources, you've got people with high social status, you have people with terrible social status, and they're all here in a room of 50, 60 people, and they're one church. And in this place, they all come together, and they are church. And, it's, I always feel for the people who design the liturgy and the worship, because it's a near impossible task because of the cultural backgrounds from everyone, but in time something forms, and it's bits from all over, and something forms, and then church emerges and instantiates itself, even from all of the scattered elements that have congregated in one place, which would be surprising. So I've got to land the plane at the top of the hour here.
Okay. Yeah.
So I just want to give fair warning.
Yeah.
In case there was some place you wanted to go, or something you wanted to talk about that we hadn't touched on.
Well, there was one thing that I was thinking about in relation to where Jordan Peterson is, for example, among others, possibly Tom Holland, Douglas Murray, certain others who have been insisting on the need for church, for the church to be strong, for the message of the church to be strong, for church really to do church, to be the kind of embodiment of the logos that people need, and not to pull any punches, and you were commenting on the kind of contradiction, between their saying that, but they're not actually committing themselves. And I was kind of reminded of C.S. Lewis's experience, and I don't know if you're familiar with the Pilgrim's Regress. Have you read the Pilgrim's Regress?
I should reread it. I'd read that 15, 20 years ago, so it's been a while.
Yeah, I read it a long time ago as well. I listened to it again just recently, but you have this, I think it's underread actually, because it's fascinating. But you have this character John, who at the end of his trajectory, finds himself in the presence of Mother Kirk. And kind of standing on this cliff, okay, with the sea below him, into which he has to just let himself fall, not jump, because that would involve him struggling to stay afloat, and kind of it would involve him in making the kind of effort which is precisely what he has to stop doing in order to. So you got him standing on the cliff, but as he's standing there, these wraiths, these specters of the characters that he has encountered during his journey, of Mr. Enlightenment, Miss Halfway, or whatever the names of them are, just pulling him back, calling him and preventing him from making that last leap, or trying to, and so he eventually allows himself just to fall into this this pool, and he takes the plunge. Well, he doesn't take the plunge, he just allows himself. He lets go and lets God, in a sense. I mean, he gives up struggling, because he doesn't need to be convinced any longer. The truth is clear to him. and that was, I suppose, reflective of C.S. Lewis's own experience when he described himself as the most reluctant convert in all England, being dragged kicking and screaming, because there were voices that were pulling him back, that were telling him off for making such for being so kind of primitive, or so I just thought that was that I can kind of see Jordan Peterson and Tom Holland kind of standing on the cliff, and they're aware, they know the truth. The truth is clear to them, but there's something kind of telling them not to take that leap. John Vervaeke might be there as well.
Yeah. I love that image, and I'm going to dig up Pilgrim's Regress and review it again, because I think that's a very appropriate image. I think perhaps this cadre of individuals, Jordan Peterson, Tom Holland, Douglas Murray, John Vervaeke, they are waiting for an old new thing to be born. I mean, because new churches continue to come into the world, because the world needs it, but they're also very old, because the thread is not lost, but there's a misfit, and in anyone who commits to a church has to resign themselves to a degree of misfitting, because there's always something that doesn't connect, and you just have to say, okay. And for Lewis, the message, the music, the liturgy, it was, I mean, because of course, given Lewis's who he was and his education, what poor local Anglican church is going to really meet his standards? But he has to stop the idolatry of his standards and humble himself and learn some of the wisdom of humility and discipline, and all of us have to do that in church, and that is the act of love.
Exactly. That is very clear in the Screwtape Letters, for example. That is kind of among the temptations that the enemy tries to derail him with. These annoying individuals sitting behind him and in front of him, and this awful music, fourth standard poetry set to fifth standard music, and or fourth rate poetry set to fifth rate music. I think he was a bit hard on some of the hymnology that he might have been referring to, but anyway, but you can understand that, but so these things have to be set aside, because the truth is too valuable not to be grasped, whatever it might mean in terms of the where we end up.
Well, and our need is too great. I mean, that's I often think of Naaman, when the servant comes out and says, well, Elisha isn't going to come out to meet you, but go dunk yourself 3 times in the Jordan and it'll be okay. And he takes offense. I'm a
Yeah,
great man.
that image occurred to me as well when I was listening to Pilgrim's Regress. You know, it was like a replaying of that story. It was, yeah.
And of course, it's the slave, you know, his own slaves,
that's right,
who tell him,
yeah,
if you'd asked for something really hard, you would have done it. This is
yeah,
your pride. And so, of
yeah.
course, he goes into the Jordan and becomes clean, and then is filled with gratitude. And, you know, now suddenly the world is different. And that's part of the limitation of the first personal, that we have to, you know, it can't all simply be first personal. It has to be third personal, but it can't all be third personal. It has to also be first personal. And so we live between the two. Well, Roger, I've got to hang up now, but this has been delightful.
It's been great. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for.
I will send you the copy of it, and you can let me know if this is something that you'd be willing to let me share in my channel.
I'd be, well, okay, I'll have a look at it first before I.
Okay, that's just. I mean, if you want to give me license, you can look at it with everyone else too. That happens too sometimes, but it's up to you.
Okay, I appreciate your devoting this slot of your very valuable time to me, and thank you very much, and thank you for all that I've been gleaning from you as well. And maybe we'll be able to have another conversation at some point.
All right, maybe one of these. I'd love to get to Barcelona and visit Spain.
I'd love you to come. I mean, if you could, I think it would be great.
I'd love to meet your church and see your Delta group. It just sounds absolutely delightful.
Be fantastic.
Right.
Okay,
take care.
Okay, you too. Bye.
Bye-bye.